Have you ever been in a place that was really dark and you just stumbled around falling over yourself or falling over and hurting yourself? Hi, I'm Ken Yates with Grace Evangelical Society, and I would like to share a few things with you today if I could. When I was in the military, part of my time I was stationed in Hawaii, and there are these cliffs there that we called them the Kahukus. I don't know if they're still called that or not, but we would walk at night, and they weren't real tall cliffs, but they were a series of short cliffs. And as we walked in them at night, it was very, very dark. You couldn't see anything. And soldiers and myself would be climbing up, and we would step in the wrong place and we would fall back down the cliff. We might fall 8 or 10 feet or something, sliding down this cliff. And you would hear other people do it as well. You couldn't see them, but you would hear them. And you would hear some certain choice words as they were falling down with all their equipment. Like I said, it was pitch black and you couldn't see anything, and people were just falling. And certainly if you were leading somebody else, like if you were a sergeant, you were telling your privates to follow after you and you fell down, they would fall down with you. So sometimes you would hear like 4 or 5 guys fall down together. I always think of that when I read Jesus's words in Luke chapter 6, verses 39 and 40. Here's what the Lord said. He spoke a parable to them. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they both not fall into the ditch? In my mind, fall down one of these Kahuku cliffs. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who is perfectly trained will be like his teacher. In these verses in Luke 6, what Jesus is saying is that if you are a teacher, you can be a blind teacher, and you need to be careful who you follow. He's talking to the disciples here, by the way. And he says, you can follow a blind teacher, a teacher who is in darkness. And when you do that, just like the guys in the Kahukus, you're going to fall down. And the people you lead are going to fall down. Just recently, I was in a Bible class at a Bible college, and the teacher was teaching from James chapter 2. And I just have to say, he was in complete darkness about what was going on in James chapter 2. Most people say there's 2 kinds of faith there, but really, he says there's 3. There's a false faith, there's a demonic faith, and then there's a real faith. And he said, well, how do you know if you have a real faith? Well, there's 3 elements to it. Of course, this is not scriptural, but this is what he says. He says there's an intellectual component. You have to know what is being said. Then there's emotional component to it. You have to grasp it. You have to be excited about it. And then there is an aspect of it where you show it by your good works. And so in order to have a real faith, you have to understand what's being said. You have to hug it. That was his words. And then you have to demonstrate that you have that faith by the good works that you do. And that's how you know you have a real faith. Of course, that is not what James 2 is talking about. And what James 2 is talking about is if you want your faith to become strong and become vital in your life, you need to exercise it with works. It has nothing to do with whether you are actually saved or not. But he went from that darkness, and he was teaching other students this. And he went on a tour of the Bible to show how these things work out. And he would go to all these different passages, and each one was like a Kahuku cliff that he would fall down, or in the words of Jesus, was like a ditch that he would fall in because he didn't understand what he was teaching. He was in complete doctrinal darkness. For example, he said Saul in the Old Testament is an example of someone who had an intellectual faith, but since he committed suicide, he didn't have a emotional faith or a real faith. So he said Saul obviously going to be in hell. Even though in Samuel 10 it says that he was a prophet, that he prophesied. Then he went on to another passage in Mark chapter 4 about the four soils. And he said the rocky soil represents someone who has an intellectual faith, but he doesn't have an emotional faith. And because of that, he's burned up and he's going to go to hell as well. Then he went to another passage of scripture in 2 Corinthians 13:5, and he said, examine yourself to see if you have an intellectual faith, an emotional faith, and you have a faith that manifests itself in works, and therefore you have a true faith. And then, of course, he went through James chapter 2 and completely butchered that as well. So what you see in this example is doctrine is important. We live in a world where we say truth is relative, and why should we argue over or discuss these finer points of doctrine? Well, the reason why is you can see what this man did in James chapter 2. In James chapter 2, he plunged into doctrinal darkness. He completely ignored the context of James chapter 2, completely misunderstood what James is talking about, and that led him to walk around in the darkness. And it wasn't enough that he did it on his own. He was spreading that doctrine to everybody else. He was doing exactly what Jesus is warning about here in Luke chapter 6. And by the way, let me remind you, Jesus is talking to the disciples. We can do this as believers. And this man, as I was listening to him teach, as he was in doctrinal darkness, was just like those guys that I experienced in the Kahukus. They would fall down. Every passage that he went to try to make his point that faith is all these elements to it, or it has all these elements to it, and you got to have good works or you're really not saved. And if you're not emotional about it, then you're really not saved. If you don't have enough good works, you're really not saved. And then he would fall in the ditch in every one of these passages he would go to, and he would take his students with him. Doctrine's important. We need to ask the Lord to give us eyes to understand what his word has to say, so that not only we don't fall down the cliff, but we don't take other people with us. If you like what you've heard, press the like button. And if you really like it, we would ask that you press the subscribe button at the bottom of the page. And remember, focus on Christ.